So Redux is a really hefty subject to get into, but did you know that there is a hook that will allow you to create local state using a Redux-like store? So in this tutorial we're going to take a look at the useReducer hook and how you can use it to actually store your data in a Redux-like manner. And we'll be creating a sticky note application to demonstrate how you might use these hooks. So let's take a look at the project and get coding.
Okay, so before we get started coding, let's actually have a look at the app that we're going to be building. So we've got this text area where we can type in a note that we want to leave ourselves. So we might put something in there like don't forget to feed the cat or something similar. And then if we click the add button here, what it actually does is it creates one of these sticky notes, and that's quite cool, and we can create as many of those as we like. And the UI has been put together so you can actually just drag and drop those anywhere on the page. But the main point of the tutorial really is to look at that useReducer hook and see how we can have the state about these actual sticky notes held in a Redux style pattern without actually importing the Redux library. So what state are we actually holding in the app? Well, there's the number of sticky notes that we've got, the time the last one was created, and also we've got the notes themselves, so that's just an array with the text that's stored. And of course we can actually modify that array, so if we actually click the close button, we'll remove that item from the array. And our Redux store actually updates, and you can see that the number of sticky notes has gone down. And of course the actual note itself is no longer in the array. Okay, so that's just a quick overview. If you've checked the code out from GitHub, that will be on the master branch, and you can just run that with the serve command, which is in our package.json, so npm run serve. But what we're going to do now is actually go over to the setup branch, which will just clear out all of the existing work and reset our app to a starting point. So for this tutorial, I've just put some of the boilerplate CSS and some of the scaffolding for the React app already in, so we can get started looking at this Redux pattern and how we can use it to manage the state for our sticky notes. But I think our first job is to create that text area first of all, so that we can actually start adding some data into the state. And then we're going to look at the Redux pattern, how we can use that to actually add stuff in, and then we'll look at the drag and drop, before finally wrapping up with how to actually update the state to actually delete sticky notes as well. So hopefully that all makes sense, but should become clear as we go through the app. So let's head on over to the app.js file, and this is the only React file that we're going to be working on in this tutorial, just to keep everything together, and you can see how everything fits together without having to get bogged down with different files. So as you can see, we've got the heading level 1 tag at the moment with our sticky notes, and we're going to work on putting that text area into the app first. So we're going to add a form tag which will hold our text area and our button to actually add a new note. So let's give that a class name, so we're going to be styling that in a moment too. So note form is the class name, and also whilst we're here we'll just set up an onSubmit function, or handler rather, so that when the user actually clicks the add button or submits this form, we're going to trigger a function, and we'll just call that add note. And up here in our app component, let's create that function now. So it's just add note, and we'll just set it to a blank arrow function for the moment. Okie doke, so in the actual form itself, let's set up a text area, and let's remove all of this. We're going to put some styles in a minute, and we'll just put a placeholder, a bit of text in as well, so just say something like create a new note. And then we want the button as well to actually submit the form, so if we add that in there and save it, you can see we've got our text area and button appearing on the page. So let's just go and add some styles to that now so that it's looking as it should on the page. So there's a few things to do here. Let's just say the note form class that we had, we'll say its display property is flex, but we want it as a column. And we'll set a static width of 200 pixels. Now let's target the text area inside of there, and I'm just going to set the font family to Arial, Helvetica, or whatever sans serif font we can find. Okay, so let's put a little bit of border on this, so 1 pixel solid, and I'm just going to use a built-in light grey colour for that. And I don't want it to stretch or anything on the page, so I'm just going to set a min width of 100%, but also a max width of 100%. So at the moment you can actually just go and drag this to any size that you like, so that will just prevent that from happening. And also we'll just say it's got a height of 100 pixels and a bit of padding inside. And let's also just remove the outline as well. Okay, so that's the text area styled for us. Let's actually do the button now. So just ensure it's got a width of 100%. We'll set the background color. This is actually going to be the color that matches the note image that we're going to be using for the sticky note background. And we'll say the cursor is pointer. Again, let's put a bit of padding on here and remove the border. We'll also remove any outline should that exist. And we'll just set a hover event on that too. And set the background color of that button when it's hovered to tomato. And also the text color to white. Okay, so that's what we had previously before we reset the project. So we'll leave the styling for now and go back to some of the functionality. So before we look at the Redux pattern, let's actually just set up some state to handle this note input. So this won't be part of our Redux store, but we want to capture the note input text that the user is typing. So we'll store that in a bit of state called note input, and we'll have set note input as the setter. So that is just going to be using the use state hook. And we'll just set that to an empty string on initialization. So let's initialize the value of the text area input with the state of note input. And then what we're going to do is hook into the onChange event. So when something changes in there, what we're going to do is the event that comes out of it, we're going to set the note input state equal to the event.target.value. So just to show you what that's doing, if we just actually use some JSX templating here to actually show the note input state, when we actually type in here, you should be able to see there that the note input state variable has actually received whatever we've typed into the text area box. Okay, so the next natural thing to do would be to work on this function here for adding the note, but what we're actually going to be doing inside that add note function is sending a request to our Redux store via an action, so we kind of need to set that up really before we can actually start implementing this function. So this is the kind of meat of what I wanted to show you in this tutorial. So we're going to be using the useReducer hook in just a moment, but what we need to pass into that is an actual reducer function, so let's create that first. And let's just call it notes reducer. And this function that we're going to pass into the hook is going to take two arguments. The first is the previous state, and then the action that is being performed on the store. Okay, so there's different ways we can do this, but probably the most traditional way to do it is having a switch statement, which does different actions depending on the different action type that's been passed in. So we'll just use static strings for this example. So if the actual action type that's been passed in is a string that is just called add_note, then we're going to do something. And what we want to do when we receive this add note action is to basically take the action.payload, which will be passed in this add note function in just a moment, and add that into an existing list of nodes. So it might help at this point just to actually visualize the state that we're going to be storing in our Redux store. And we can do that by creating a new variable that is basically going to hold the initial note state. It doesn't have to be note state. In fact, we could use app state to just say that it's representative of the entire app. But because this reducer and this state is going to all be about notes, I'm just going to call it initial note state. Okay, so this is just an object and it's going to have a few properties, and these are the properties that are essentially the state items that we're storing in our Redux store. So we're going to have one property in there called the last note created, so that'll be the time when we last created a note. And we'll also keep track of the total notes that we've created, and also an array of those notes. So if you think back to the start of the tutorial when we looked at the working example, we had under the title, we had when we actually created the last note, so that's that first item here. And then there was also the count of how many notes we had created, which is this property here. And then inside this notes array is going to be a list of all of the sticky notes and the corresponding text that we've created. Okay, so when we receive this add note action, what we want to do is update our state. So just to make this clear, what I'm going to do is create a new variable called new state, and this is going to basically be a copy of what we've got in the initial note state with some changes that have been made with the payload that's been passed in on the action. So we're going to have the same thing. We're going to have the last note created property. We're going to have the total notes. And we're also going to have the notes themselves. Okay, so the last note created, what we're going to do here is going to just get the time of when this function was actually called. So we'll generate a new date object and just call the toTimeString function, which will give us like quite a long string about the current date and time. But if we're a bit cheeky here and just kind of slicing off the first 8 digits, and that will give us the current time that this note was created. Obviously, if we were doing this properly, we'd probably use some kind of a library to get the correct date or time, or save the actual timestamp as well. But just for this tutorial, that will do us for now. Okay, so with the total notes, we need to work out how many notes we've already got, and then increase that by 1 because we're adding a new note at this point. So there are different ways we can do this, but just as an illustration, we can get from the previous state the notes array, and then we can just say, well, how many notes are in that array at the moment? So if it's 0 on the initial state, then this will give us back the value of 0, and we're just going to add 1 more to it. So thereby the total notes on this first time we call the add note action will actually increase to 1. And this is a bit of a stupid bit of state to hold, because we could just obviously access the length property of the notes array and then put that onto our view. But I just wanted to show you how you can store different bits of state and how you would calculate that state when you're updating things via the reducer. So the notes themselves, we know it's going to be an array, and we basically want to spread in the previous notes. So with the previous state, notes, we can get the previous array and repopulate this new notes array. And then of course we're going to have a new note in here as well, and as I mentioned before, this will be on a property called payload, which is provided on the action. And when we dispatch one of these actions in just a moment, you'll see how this payload property gets populated. But just for now, just assume that this has actually got a new sticky note that we're going to be adding into our Redux store. So the reason I put this into a new state variable is because I just want to actually log it out to the console so I can show you exactly what that looks like. So what does our state look like after we've added a new note? And it will be the new state variable. But really what we need to do in this switch statement here is to actually just return the new state. So that's the whole point of a reducer, is to take an action and the state as it currently is, and basically update that state and then return the new modified state depending on what action has been fired. Okay, so that's our first Redux action. We're just going to leave that as it is for the moment. We're going to be coming back to this in just a bit. But what we can actually do now is use the useReducer hook. So let's just import it here. And just where we're setting our note input state, we'll set our Redux store up by using the hook just in here. So we'll say the note state, and also we can grab out a function called dispatch is equal to the useReducer hook. And we'll pass in, the first thing is the actual reducer we want to use, so it's notes reducer. And also we pass in an initial state, which we could just actually hard code in here as an object, but because we went through that process of just creating that variable there, it's quite handy because we can just pass that in as the initial state. Okay, so we have our first Redux store set up, and we've got access to the note state and also the dispatch function as well. So how do we actually use those? Well, let's have a look at the add note function that we stubbed out just a moment ago. So first things, the add note function is going to receive an event when the form is submitted. So let's grab a hold of that. So the first thing I'm going to do, because we're submitting a form, I'm just going to call event.preventDefault, and that will just stop the form from reloading. So if we now click add here, it doesn't actually try and reload the page and send a backend request, it just pauses here. And the first thing I'm going to add in here is just to check if the note input state, which if you remember is basically whatever we've typed in here, if that's actually empty, if there's nothing in there, then we'll just return. We don't want to do anything. We don't want to add a blank empty sticky note to our Redux store. So we're ready now to actually add something into our store. So let's create a new note by saying const new note. So the main thing I want to create is a property on the note called text, and that will be equal to the note input, again, whatever we've typed into the text area. So with the new note created, we can actually send that to our Redux store using that dispatch function that we imported. And what we actually dispatch is an action. So we need to specify the type, which is add note. That's the only one that we've created at the moment. And the payload is the new note object that we just created above that line. So this object we're sending to the dispatch function has the type and payload properties, which if you see in the reducer, that's what gets passed to the action argument here. And that's where you can see in our switch statement, we've got action.type and action.payload. So we can actually save that now. And if we just go to our development tools, and if we type something into the sticky note and then click add, you can see we've got our Redux store here. So we've got the last note created timestamp and the total number of notes that we've got. And if we inspect the notes array, you can see we've got one item in that array that is an object that has a property of text, which is exactly what we've just typed in here. So let's type something else in there, 2 for the second actual item. And now you can see we've got 2 total notes in there, and the array should have both of those objects in there. So that's a really simple way to get some Redux type state into your app. And hopefully you've seen how the reducer and dispatch function work together to manage the state for our sticky notes that we're creating. Okay, so the tutorial does not end there. We're going to actually carry on and create the sticky note interface. Pretty much everything else we're going to do now is window dressing right up until we add another action to delete the notes. So let's plow through that so we can have a look at how that other action will work. Okay, so first things first, I just want to create a bit more of a complex note when I'm adding it to the store. I want to create a note that has an ID so I can actually find it in the array later when we want to delete it. So I'm going to generate a random ID for it. So this project as set up has the uUID package installed. So assuming you've installed all of the dependencies for the project, you should be able to import the uUID module like this. That'll just give me a function called uUID, which I can call to give this note a unique identifier. And there was one other thing for the sticky notes as well. You probably didn't notice it at the start of the tutorial, but I added a property on there called rotate, which just rotates each of the sticky notes just by a slight amount on the x-axis, just so that they don't all sit in the same position. And you'll see what I mean when we add some more notes again. So I'm just going to create a random number up to 20 to handle that. So if we refresh the page and just add in some more notes again, you should see now the note that gets created in the array is slightly different. So we've got an ID and it's got a rotation value and of course the text. So we'll come back to that ID property in a moment because we'll use that to actually delete the note. Before we do that, let's actually create the notes on the page and then we'll look at the drag and drop element of it as well. Okay, so let's remove that bit of state from here. Okay, so I'm just going to access the notes state. So this is going to be the overall Redux store that we've got. And I want to get the notes array out of there. And for each of those, I'm going to map this to some JSX. So for each note, I want to return this template. Okay, so we're going to return a div, has a class name of note. Close that up. Probably don't want that semicolon there. Okay, so the main thing inside of here is just going to be a pre-formatted block of text. And we'll give that a class name of text, and that should just be equal to the note text. Okay, so if we add a new note in here, you can see that gets added to the page. If we add some more notes in, you can see they all get added in a list just below there. So we just need to transform this into a sticky note now. So let's add some styles to that so that they look as we would expect a sticky note to look. Okay, so the sticky note, the class of note, we're going to give it a position of absolute because it's going to be anywhere on the page. And we'll just say the cursor is pointer, so it looks like you can pick it up or at least click on it. And we'll set the background image to a URL. And in the assets folder, there is a post-it-note.png file, so we'll set that as the background image. And the background size is going to be cover. And we're just going to add some top and left to position this note initially on the page. And after playing around with that for a bit, that was something that I found out it should just bring it to the right of the text area. And I'm going to set a specific height on this and also a specific width. And we'll also put some padding in there too. Okay, so let's try that out. Just say new note. There you go, we've got a new sticky note with our text inside. I'm just going to do a bit of formatting on that text. So the text class inside of there, just make sure the font family is set as we would like it, and just make sure it takes up the correct amount of width and height inside the element. Because what I'm going to do is with the white space, I'm just going to say pre-wrap, and also the overflow Y will also be scroll. So this just means if we create something a bit like this, where there's quite a lot of text in here, and we click add, then we can scroll it on the page, and it actually fits inside of the background image that we've applied. So mainly for aesthetics there, but just to explain what's going on there, so we don't get any text spilling out of our post-it note. Okay, so with that in place, we're going to work on the drag and drop side of things. So inside of the div that's containing our note, what we're going to do, first of all, I'm going to apply that style transform property for the rotation. So let's look at the style property, and we pass in an object to that. So we say we want to change the transform, and I'm going to rotate it by whatever the note.rotate value is, which don't forget is what we created up here when we added a new note, and just rotate the div by that many degrees. So if we create a few notes, you should see they're all at different angles, so at least they're not exactly the same. So it looks like they've been thrown onto the desktop a bit more. Okay, so I promised you the drag and drop. Let's have a look at that. So the first thing we do is just make sure that the element is draggable, and also the on drag end event. We will give that a function called a drop note, which we'll just create now. And of course, what we should do when we've got repeating elements in React is set a key. And quite luckily, we've got the ID property that we created on the notes. So we should be able to save that. And the error that we were getting in the console before about duplicate keys has disappeared. Okay, so we've got a function ready for our drag and drop. What we're actually going to do though for our entire app, because we can drag and drop any of these notes anywhere on the page, is basically handle an event called onDragOver. So we'll pass that a function which we'll stub out here. And this just gets fired when anything is being dragged around in the app. So let's have a look at that drag over function first of all. So we get an event in there. So we want to do a couple of things in here. We want to first of all stop the propagation of any further events from happening, and also we'll call the event .prevent default. So if we create a new note now, we still won't be able to drag, but there's you can see that the sticky note is draggable. We just need to finish off that other event, so when it gets dropped, the actual positioning of the sticky note gets updated. So let's do that now. So we've got the event here. Within the event, we've actually got the target, which in this case will be the actual element that holds the sticky note. So let's just update its style, equal, rather its left property, equal to wherever we've dropped it on the page. Oops, page X. And again, having played around with this a little bit, if I just subtract 50 pixels, it kind of drops it in the middle of where your mouse was rather than the top left, which is where the origin is. So then we just do the same thing for the top property. So instead of this time, we say the page Y, and again, minus 50 pixels. So when we actually finish dropping the sticky note, what will happen is this event will fire, and the actual element itself will have its left and top properties updated to wherever you dropped it on the page. So let's save that and create a new note. And now if we actually pick up the note and drop it over here, you can see that drop event is fired and the positioning properties for the note are updated, and it should work pretty much everywhere if we just drag and drop it anywhere on the page. And of course, if we create another new note, and it's created in the default position, but then we can drag and drop it anywhere on the page. And don't forget, all the time our Redux store is working for us. It's having the state updated with the total number of notes, and that notes array is holding information about the notes that we've created. It doesn't matter that they're being positioned anywhere else on the page. That's just the presentation of it. The data is still remaining the same in the actual store. Okay, so one thing I'm just going to do before we move on is once we've actually created a new note, I'm just going to set the note input value to an empty string again. So just when we create a new note, it just resets that for us. That's lovely. Okay, so before we start to wrap up, what we're going to do is put in the delete button to actually remove an item from the notes state via an action, and then updating the state in our reducer. So let's actually add the button in first. I'm just going to create a new div, and this will hold our icon for actually deleting a note. And I think in the original app, what I did is I just went to hero icons, which is from Tailwind, and just searched for a close button. And I think it was this one here. So I'm just going to copy the SVG out of that and pop it into there. And we just want to style that as well, because it's obviously taking a bit too much out there. I think when you do that as well, directly from hero icons, you need to change these CSS properties because they're not actually JSX compliant. But if we just do that, those errors should go away in the console. Yep. So yeah, we just need to style that button because it's way too big. Okay, so the class we created was close, and we'll just say its width 15 pixels, height same again, 15 pixels. Position we'll just say is absolute. And then we'll just make sure that it's pushed in from the right hand side by about 15 pixels. And I'm just going to add a transition property for transform for about 0.3 seconds. And of course, when we hover over that, we'll just scale it up a bit. So transform, scale 1.6. Okay, let's create another note and see how that looks. Okay, so now we've got a little close icon, and if you hover over it, you can see it just makes it a bit bigger so you can click it. But of course, if we click that at the moment, nothing happens. So let's handle that event in our React code. So let's tidy this up. So when you actually click on this close button, we want to handle the on-click event. And we could create a separate function for this, but what I will do here is just dispatch a new action. So the action I want to dispatch is going to have a type of delete note, okay, and the payload I want to send through this time is we'll just send the whole note through. We only really are interested in the ID, but let's just pass the whole note to the reducer so that we can handle that in there. Okay, so what we need to do in our reducer is to handle that event. So let's scroll all the way up here. So when we add a note, this block of code gets run, but if we delete a note, we want to run this block of code here. So same as adding a note, I'm going to create a new state object which will then pass back, and this is more just to show you exactly what is going on, and we can log it to the console as well to see how the state gets updated. So the first thing I'm going to do is just copy the previous state object into there, because we don't want to actually update the last note created item in the Redux store. So that's always going to stay the same. So this will copy the entire object. And this is good practice because if there's lots of other items in the store as well, it will copy all of those across, and whatever we update below this will be counted as the update. So we only need to actually specify the things that we're changing. So we had total notes as part of the state before, so all we need to do is the previous state dot notes dot length -1. You could of course say previous state dot total notes -1 as well, same thing really. As I said before, this is a bit of useless state really, but just as an example of things that you could hold in your store. And then the notes themselves, that's actually pretty simple. So we take the previous notes that we had in the state beforehand, and we can just filter them based on the note that we've got. So we're just checking each of the notes IDs in the array of notes, and just check if that's not equal to the action.payload.id. So don't forget, when we passed in the dispatch action down here, we passed in the whole note. So up here on the payload, this is actually going to be a whole note. So we've got access to that ID, the text, etc., but we just only need to check for the ID here. Okay, so this filter function will run through all of the notes and only remove the note that has the ID that matches the note that's been passed in on the payload. So let's console.log that out so you can see what's happening. So after delete note, And our block here needs to just return that state. So all being well, if we create a new note now, let's create another one as well, so second note. So we can delete the first one. And then you'll see that the delete note action was called. And you can see the state looks like this after the note's been deleted. So the total notes value has been updated to 1. And also the array of notes has only got the one note that has the text of second note. And of course we can delete that as well. And then our store has 0 notes and 0 notes in the array. Okay, so that is our second action that we've created for our notes reducer. And of course you can keep creating different actions. Maybe you want to update the rotation, or maybe you want to kind of save the X and Y position of where the note is on the page. We could also add in lots of different things like that. But hopefully that's given you an idea of how you can set up some basic actions in our reducer and actually then update the state, which in turn updates the UI of the app. Okay, so just to wrap up, we're going to put that little bit of meta information on underneath the title here. So where have we got sticky notes? Here it is. What we're going to do here is put the notes state dot total notes. You can see it wasn't totally useless putting that information in there. We're going to use it right directly here. So we've got 0 notes at the moment, and if we create one in there, you can see we've got 1 note. And then just underneath that as well, we'll create a span, which will check the note state again, which will actually say if the total notes is bigger than 0, then we want to display the last created information. So using a template literal, we'll say last note created. And then in our note state, we can access that last note created item in the state, which will have the timestamp of when we did create that last note, but if not, we'll just return an empty string. Oops, I've got the change the template literal to finish there. Okay, so if you save that and create a new note, you can see that span appearing now, and if we create another note a few seconds later, you can see that that's updated with the time that the last note was created. Okay, so that is it for today. That's the end of our tutorial. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about the useReducer function and also a little bit about the Redux pattern in general. And we've looked at how you can create a reducer and use it to manage your state and dispatch actions to actually manage and update that state, and then use the state in your UI to display fun things like sticky notes. So just before you go, if you found that useful, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and give me a thumbs up and drop me a comment if you've got any questions. But otherwise, I'll see you next time for the next React tutorial.